Lion in the Wind, Chapter 28. 6 months later. Black pounded his desk in anger. "Why are they still roaming free?" he growled over the phone. "I can assure you that the army is doing all it can," replied Jocelyn. "Well, it's apparently not enough. Those lions need to be gone, or else they're going to severely encumber my plans. You agreed to help me in exchange for riches and power in my new kingdom. And yet you seem bent on failing me repeatedly. What else do you want me to do? It's taken the last 6 months of hunting these machines just to take down what few we have. In fact, from the reports I've read, it's a miracle that we've already gotten as many of them as we have. And I'm doing the best I can to expedite this without raising any suspicions," said Jocelyn. "Well, do better or I will replace you," screamed Black. He slammed the phone down and then got up and paced furiously across his office. He stopped, took several deep breaths and calmed himself. There has to be a better way to deal with this. I am mere weeks from launching my new prototype and I need to be rid of those lions before I do. "Once your prototype is active, they will be of little consequence," said Elgar. Black waved his hand dismissively. "Yes, but I'd rather not have to deal with them at all, even if Garmek is stronger than they are. The sooner the lions are destroyed, the happier I'll be," said Black. He then thought for several moments before asking, "How many of the lions are still unaccounted for?" "About 20, sir." 20. And Chigani?" Elgar shook his head. "He's still unaccounted for, sir." Black swore. "That's another problem we need to solve quickly." "But there's only 20 of them left, sir. How could they be a threat to you anymore?" "Because Chigani's still alive. Even if he was the only lion left alive, there is still a chance that he could hinder my plans." "But how?" "He is unlike any enemy I have ever encountered before. So long as he lives, our plans are at risk. Now, get out there, and make sure he's destroyed." Elgar nodded. "I'll see what I can do." Chigani watched as 2 lions approached him from the prairie below. He stepped out of his hiding spot and signaled to them. They quickly joined him under the cover of a small grove of trees. "What did you find?" he asked. The first lion shook his head. "Nyamra's unit is gone. When we went looking for them, we stumbled onto an army unit that was loading their bodies into a truck," said one of the lions. "What about the information they were gathering?" asked Chigani. "We found it at the dead drop as expected. It's been passed on to Major Delgra and his team as you requested." Chigani contorted his face in thought. "How many of us does that leave then?" he asked, half knowing the answer. "Only about 9 that we know of." Chigani grimaced at this. Despite all they'd done, the Yigzan army had successfully decimated his family, reducing them from the great pride that they once were to a mere handful of survivors. While it broke his heart to know this, he kept this pain to himself. He knew that letting his emotions run free right now was the worst thing he could do. He would have time to grieve later. For now, there was a mission to complete. "All right, then we need to spread out again. Keep doing what you've been doing and we'll meet up at our next rally point in 2 days," he said. The 2 lions nodded, turned and ran off into the prairie. Penn slipped out of his hiding place and walked up to Chigani. "They've almost destroyed all of us, and we're no closer than we were 6 months ago," he said. "We're doing more than you think. The information we've gathered has been instrumental in helping the Major find all the elements of Black's network. It'll make it easier for him to shut it down when the time comes." Penn grunted. "Assuming we live long enough to reach that point." Chigani frowned. "I would like to think that we will. But with the army tracking us as they have, that will grow increasingly more difficult." "Are you really sure we can do this?" asked Penn. Chigani shook his head. "I don't know anymore. I know what we must do, but I don't know if we'll have enough time, or strength, to do it." "So what happens if we die?" Chigani's eyes narrowed. "I don't know, but I don't plan to find out." Bergen paced back and forth as he tried to alleviate the boredom that had been steadily creeping up on him. He understood the reason for his confinement, but at the same time he wondered if it was really worth it anymore. He'd been there for over 6 months and was growing tired of the food, the company, and the cramped spaces. Citizen and Gorg soldiers were coming and going every day on missions for Oik and Fergant, as well as a handful of Yigzan soldiers who were working for Delgra. Persia, however, had been luckier than Bergen in that, being a tiger, she could wander the hills freely without risk of being identified, because anyone who might see her would easily mistake her for one of her wild cousins. Only if she spoke would she give away her true identity. As he paced back and forth in his room, he felt a familiar warmth surround him as though it were embracing him. "Idias," came a soft and gentle voice. Bergen spun in surprise to see Mashwa standing behind him. He immediately dropped to his knees, and bowed. "Mashwa, why have you come here?" he asked. "Prepare yourself. You have one more mission ahead of you. In 1 week's time, a great battle will ensue. You will be there." Bergen blinked, and looked up at Misha in surprise. "A battle? But I'm no soldier," he said. "Your weapons will not be knife or pistol. It will instead be your wits and those gifts which I have given you. Be ready, for your time is short," said Mashwa. "But what about Persia? I can't leave her. And what about Oik? It's his duty to protect me." Mashwa smiled. "I have already talked to them. Their place will be with you. Now, rest and prepare yourself." And with that, he was gone. Black looked up at the large armored robot in front of him and grinned with devilish delight. "Is it ready?" he asked, barely masking his giddiness. "Very nearly. There are a few bugs I still need to work out. But after that it should be ready for a test run," said a scientist nearby. "It's such a brute. I can't wait to see it in action," said Black with seditious glee. He walked around the large robot and caressed its giant arms. "How hard would this be to reproduce in large quantities?" he asked. The man shrugged. "Not hard. We could manufacture probably 50 of these a day using the existing facilities we have here." Black rubbed his hands together in delight. "Good. I can't wait to send it for a test drive. If this weapons system performs as good as you've said it will, I'll make sure you are rewarded handsomely. You're already paying me handsomely for this unit. What more could you offer me?" Black gestured grandly. "Oh, more than you could possibly imagine." The scientist smiled greedily. "Oh, believe me, I can imagine a lot." Elgar walked over to Black and whispered in his ear. Black's eyes went wide, and then narrowed as he began to grin like a Cheshire cat. "Good. Keep me informed if they find him," he said. Elgar nodded, and then slipped away. The scientist looked at him in curiosity. "Is there something I should know about?" Black shook his head as he continued to grin. "No. I'm just tidying up a few loose ends." The scientist nodded knowingly. Welk watched as a soldier kicked a flat tire on his truck, cursed at it, and then flinched as another one popped on the other side, deflating with a loud hiss. The soldier swore even louder, and then walked around the back of the truck screaming obscenities at the top of his lungs. Welk slipped out of his hiding place and made his way back to his buggy. He soon pulled onto the main road and quickly gained speed. Another buggy pulled onto the road behind him, followed by 2 more. They continued on for another 15 minutes before pulling off onto the shoulder. They all then climbed out of their vehicles and gathered around Sims. He produced a map from his pocket and laid it out across the hood of his buggy. "Did you get all the tires in the 5th column?" asked Welk. One of the men nodded. "Not all of them. But I got enough that they won't be going anywhere soon," he said. "Good. That now puts 1/3 of the 3rd out of action for a while." Sim shook his head. "It still feels weird sabotaging our own guys," he said. "Well, if it keeps Chagani and the other lions alive long enough to nail that madman, I'm all for it," said Welk. "Where to next, Sergeant?" asked one of the men. Welk tapped a small circle on the map. "We're going to sabotage 1st of the 7th next, assuming they're still where they're supposed to be." This operation, however, will be a little different since they're an armored unit. So puncturing tires or letting all the H2 out of their tanks isn't going to be possible. The men nodded in understanding. So what are we going to do? I'm not entirely sure how to stop an armored vehicle short of blowing holes in it, said Sims. Welk grinned. If you can't destroy them, then bottle them up. The three men looked at him curiously. What are you talking about? Asked Sims. Welk pointed to a small box drawn on the map, and said, the LAVs run on hydrogen power cells just like every other army vehicle. However, they're more fuel-hungry, and thus require more frequent stops. Ah, so starve them of fuel, and they can't do any harm, said one of the soldiers. Welk nodded. Exactly. But to do that we need to prevent them from refueling. The good news is, they should be just about out of H2 by now and ready to refill their tanks. He slid his finger down the map a short ways to another square. This is the switching and valve station for the L-27 arm of the hydrogen transfer system. If we go there and close all the valves, that should cut off all the hydrogen going to these fueling stations up here. After that we make off with all the valve handles so they can't turn the flow back on. With no H2 for their vehicles, they won't be able to go anywhere for quite a while. They'll have to bring fuel trucks in to get them refueled. The men nodded in approval. I like the plan. But isn't that a bit too simple, said Sims. Sometimes the simplest plans are the best. Alright, let's mount up and get to that station before they can get any of their vehicles refueled. The men hurried back to their buggies and were soon on their way to their next objective. Delgra read the long list of reports coming into him from all over the nation. As he did, Odivian walked into the office and handed him a stack of papers. I think that's all of them. We should now have Black's entire network mapped out, he said. Delgra flipped through the pages and nodded. Good. Keep our spies looking for any small fingers we may have inadvertently missed. Yes, sir. What about the commanders who volunteered their units for our attack? Asked Delgra. They're ready and waiting for your orders. They'll come as soon as we call for them. Good. Let's begin the next stage of our plans. What are we going to do about Oik, Fergant and their units? Are we going to use them in the main assault? Asked Odivian. I've talked to them and they're going to stay back during the battle and watch our backs. Since we'll be going all in on this fight, we'll need someone like them to cover our rear flank. Good idea. Also, I've got reliable word that Black's new super weapon is nearly ready for action. We may have 3, possibly 4 days before it's ready for use. Delgra pondered this. It looks like I'll have to move sooner than I wanted to. How quickly could we activate all of the units and get them on the move? Odivian shrugged. It'd take me a couple hours at most, but we could be rolling as early as 1700 hours today if need be. Delgra waved dismissively. No, we don't need to go that early. But it'll have to be soon. Send a message to all our people. Tell them that Operation Dark Sunset begins 2 days from now at 2100 hours. Odivian saluted, and then hurried away to carry out his orders. The call went out all across the Yggdrasil nation that afternoon, activating all of the disjointed elements of Delgra's assault plan. But as the units prepared, they went about their lives normally so as to minimize the chances that someone would grow suspicious. Then, 2 days later, just as planned, the operation commenced without a hitch. Special operations units raided hidden data centers all over the Yggdrasil nation, capturing the hundreds of personnel operating in Black's employ. At this same time, a group of heavily armed MPs forced their way into Senator Jocelyn's house and found him entertaining a group of scantily clad women as he waved large bundles of money wildly in the air. He was immediately arrested and dragged outside to a waiting patrol car where he began sobbing like a baby. Other units elsewhere simultaneously began raiding one operations node after another of Black's entire information and control network, rapidly taking everything offline until nothing remained. Not even the most well-hidden control nodes escaped being shut down. It didn't take long after that for the operations center at Black's main laboratory to realize that something was wrong. Very wrong. As Black ate his dinner, Elgar rushed into the dining room, ashen-faced. Black stared at him curiously. "What's the matter?" he asked as he set down his wine glass. "Our entire network just went offline," said Elgar as he struggled to keep his composure. "What's the problem?" "Did our internet connection go down again?" asked Black. Elgar shook his head. "The connection is fine, but none of the data centers are responding. They've all gone dark." Black took a bite of his steak and pondered this as he chewed. "It's probably just a technical glitch. Tell them to try and re-establish the network," he said. "They already did, to no avail." Black pondered this for a moment. "Dispatch teams to the nearest nodes and see what the problem is." Elgar nodded. "Right away, sir." He then turned and hurried out of the room. Delgra studied the front gate and surrounding fences of Black's laboratory through his binoculars. 4 guards at the main gate, 2 patrolling the fence on each side and 6 more in the parapets on top of the second gate, he said. "This should make ingress interesting," said Odivian. "Nah. A couple of rounds in the right place and we're good to go," said Delgra. He then turned to several men at the bottom of the hill and signaled for them to begin. A series of dull thumps echoed from a line of mortars a few seconds later. The rounds arched high into the sky, and then rained down on the outer gate, shattering the fence and killing several guards. The next volley landed on top of a nearby parapet, instantly killing the guards that were there. Several more volleys were sent in, each one aimed at a different point in the defenses. After nearly 24 volleys, the mortars fell silent. Delgra studied the carnage and commotion below with satisfaction. "Send in the first wave," he said. Odivian tapped his communicator and said, "First wave, go." Engines came to life, and trucks full of infantry backed up by several LAVs roared over a nearby hilltop and towards the facility. They pushed their way through the outer wall with little effort, and then proceeded onto a breach in the inner wall. "This is going a lot easier than I expected," said Delgra. Just then a flurry of gunfire erupted from the facility. "Ah, they're right on schedule," he said. Black burst through the doors to his control center, and screamed, "What's happening?" "We're under attack, sir," shouted one of the men. "By whom?" asked Black. "Yig's army forces. 2 companies and a handful of armored vehicles just breached the outer wall," said the man. Black fumed. "Where are my forces?" he shouted. "They're responding now, sir." "They had better move quickly, or I'm going to start shooting people for incompetence," shouted Black. He glared at the tactical display in the middle of the room and studied the progress of the battle. "So, you've figured out my plans, have you? Well then, we'll just have to accelerate them." He spun on his heels and strode quickly out of the room. As he did, Elgar came down the hallway towards him. "Elgar, we're moving up our plans for the prototypes. Get down to the manufacturing facility and have them begin building units immediately." Elgar bowed slightly, and said, "As you wish." Oik and Fergant watched the battle from a distant hillside with interest. "The battle is not going well," said Oik. "Should we help them?" asked Fergant. "No. There are not enough of us. Thus it's best that we stay here for now," replied Oik. Bergen lay on the side of the hill next to them and watched the battle unfold down below as Persia lay by his side. He could feel sweat forming on his face as he thought about what possibly lay ahead for them. The camouflage paint on his face made it itch and the clothes he'd been given were too big and felt awkward to move in. Suddenly he felt himself pulled rapidly through the air and deposited in the middle of a large room. He looked up in surprise to see the inside of the robot manufacturing facility in Black's facility. Elgar stood to one side talking with several scientists. "Mr. Black wants you to begin production immediately," he said. "But we're not ready. It'll be another 2 days before we can do that," protested one of the scientists. "Make it 20 minutes or I start putting holes in people's heads." "Got it," said Elgar. The men nodded nervously. Bergen then felt himself yanked sharply backwards and once again found himself laying on the hillside. "You must stop them before they can harm your people." Now rise up and fulfill your destiny, came Mashua's voice in his head. Bergen gulped heavily, and then stared at Persia. What was that? She asked. I believe we just had a vision, replied Bergen. He then turned to Oik. We know where we need to go, he said. Oik looked at him curiously, and said, was it from Mashua? Bergen nodded. I believe it was. We were briefly drawn into the manufacturing facility. They're preparing to do something horrible there. Oik nodded in understanding, and then looked at Fergant. We have our orders. Let's get moving.